Members present, let's go around the table.
Josie Billingham.
Todd Howard.
Craig Cooley.
Catherine Bissell.
Richard Smalling.
Karen Pickard.
Great. It turns out that, hey Dudley, we're in session, my friend. It's always something. All right. Lonnie Den couldn't make it. I understand that David Purse is in Hawaii. Robert Wozniak's on call, and Christine Uhas is ill. So we have a slightly reduced group of folks here today. Josie, I think you're rotating off. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your service.
Thank you.
They have a wonderful little document you can frame and put on your office. My wife always says, well, where are you going to put that in your office?
Thank you very much.
I don't get to put anything at home anymore. So let's go ahead with the agenda. First off, Lonnie was going to talk about the action registry. Have you any information from her on that? Or?
She told me that she gave it to you, gave you a little
She
report.
gave me it.
Can we ask you all to please use the microphones?
Okay. Is that better? Okay. Sorry. Well, I don't think she gave me much. She gave me some verbiage, but I didn't get a presentation from her. You want to talk about the web portal, Catherine?
So the web portal is up and running. We did a test. We had some issues with updates that were done to the website that made the portal not work really well. We got that fixed. We have added documents to the web portal, so when you go onto the resource documents, you'll see several more pieces of information in the folders. Again, if you have anything that you would like to submit, there is a link on the web page that says for submission of documents. That will go into a folder where several members up here on the panel will review the document, and then we'll post it appropriately.
So we submitted a fair amount of information. How much of that's been posted? I haven't seen what was and wasn't posted yet. Maybe just because I've overlooked it.
Several of the documents have been posted. There is a folder in the for the members that have the ability to review the documents. There is a folder in there that shows all of the documents that have been added to the website, but also if you click on resource documents, you can see in each one of the folders what's been posted. But I would say probably at least 40% of the documents that were submitted have been reviewed, and therefore we could post them.
Okay, Craig, you part of that committee?
Yeah, we've gone through a fair number of the ones from that original submission, and I think most are eligible to be posted. There were a couple little duplications and things, and so now that we know the portal's up, we can. When we get new ones, we'll need to get
If
those.
y'all could look at that, that'd be great. And I think we probably need to add the stream trial. The stream trial. Do you have a PDF of that? I can send it to you.
Sure.
Okay. And also Dr. Anderson had a new publication on fast PCI versus primary PCI, and another one that's just been published on the same strategy in the elderly. So I'll send you all of those. Okay. Could you put up the PowerPoint? Uh-oh. Dr. Wozniak made a summary slide set of the presentations and discussions at the STEMI Texas meeting held in San Antonio. Who got to go to that? Part, so 1, 2, and were you there as well, Karen? No. I think it was a very informative meeting. So Robert put together this slide set and presented it at the cataract meeting in Austin, and Lonnie thought we ought to go over it, so we can do that. One of the papers that was discussed at some length was this report from the NCDR database on acute MI, and it talked about the results of reducing the door-to-balloon time. It's a little hard to see, but if you look closely, you can see that as the door-to-balloon time has reduced by 50% from the initiation of the effort to reduce door-to-balloon times, but unfortunately the lower bar, the lower graph there, looks at mortality, and the mortality hasn't changed at all. So despite the fact that the door-to-balloon time has been reduced, the mortality rate has stayed constant. Another little bit of information is that if you look at the subset of patients who were treated, let's see. Oops. Well, this is not. Let me see. Let me go one more. There we go. If you look at the subset of patients that were treated greater than 90 minutes, the door-to-balloon time did seem to have an impact. You can see the mortality drifting up to about close to 10%, despite the fact that the door-to-balloon times decreased, but these patients were in a subset that presented beyond 90 minutes. So one of the things that Dr. McCarthy has developed and is supposedly publishing is the fact that patients who call EMS and present to the hospital, and that's about 60% of the patients in the United States right now, the mortality rate is 10%, and those that walk in on their own, the mortality rate's about 2%. So an EMS call, a 911 call, seems to select a higher risk population. But this wasn't dealt with in this particular publication. The take-home message that Dr. Wozniak suggested was that the door-to-balloon time was still important, and there was an impact, particularly in the patients who are higher risk, who present late. But we need to focus on reducing the ischemic time, and I think we've talked about that ad nauseum in the past. And basically, I think we need to explore initiating treatment in the pre-hospital phase, and we've talked about that in some detail. And these are the conclusions he came up with. The door-to-balloon time of 90 minutes, as we've hit it, we've not made an improvement in outcomes, and so we need to move ahead with the next level of care, and I think that's going to be incumbent on us. This, I think, was from a presentation by Russell Griffin, if I'm not mistaken, and it talks about what of the population of STEMI patients presenting, it's approximately 1.1 million. That's up from previous estimates, but you can see in the first hour there is about 200,000 patients who die. So in the first hour and a half, actually. So we really need to focus on getting care delivered much earlier. And I think, again, this is no big surprise. So there was a discussion on the STREAM trial. The STREAM trial basically randomized patients, primarily in Europe and Canada, to either getting fibrinolytics pre-hospital are just being transported for primary PCI. Patients who got fibrinolytics had a mandatory delay in cath lab intervention unless they were in cardiogenic shock or refractory ventricular tachycardia. The net result was if you treated patients who were elderly with half-dose lytics, there was not a penalty in terms of bleeding or increased risk of stroke with fibrinolytics. The outcome in the fibrinolytic-treated patients was the same as with primary PCI, suggesting that not everybody has to go to the cath lab if they're treated in the field or prior to arrival at the STEMI receiving center. And so the mortality, on the other hand, was 4%, which is less than the 10% which is being bandied about, as we've discussed previously. And so what happened was they excluded patients who were in cardiogenic shock, or who had had brief cardiac arrest from being included in the trial. And those probably are the patients that have the most benefit from early fibrinolysis. So I think the bottom line from my perspective was the STREAM trial showed us that pre-hospital fibrinolysis is safe and it produces good outcomes. It might be that taking everybody to the cath lab early would be a better way than delaying their treatment, because there was a higher reinfarction rate in the pre-hospital fibrinolysis group, primarily because they didn't get their culprit artery stented, I think. Okay, there was a discussion on the SHOCK 2 trial, which is a trial that randomized patients to either balloon pump support or standard of care in cardiogenic shock. And what they found was that there really was no difference in outcome. There wasn't an improvement in mortality. There wasn't any difference in vascular complications. And so the result, one of the results that could be derived from this is balloon pumps don't help. You could take that tack, but the other tack you could say is if you initiate unloading when the shock is already developed, then the cart's out of the barn, so the horse is out of the barn, so to speak. So actually, the animal trial suggests that if you want to get benefit from unloading, you have to do it within the first 2 hours of onset of symptoms, which is almost impossible. So I think balloon pumps can certainly bridge patients to other therapies, and that really hasn't been dealt with. So I think one of the take-homes from this trial was that we really need to rethink endpoints for trials in shock patients, because once somebody has shock, it's very difficult to reverse that. LVAD implants and other things, bridge to transplantation might be the course if somebody is deemed viable. Another talk he focused on was false activation of the cath lab, and this must have been given by Dr. Mixon because it's from Scott and White. You can see that. Apparently they looked at their data from Scott and White, and the things that correlated with false activations, in other words, activations of the cath lab that turned out to be false alarms, were absence of chest pain, lack of reciprocal ST changes, symptoms lasting longer than 6 hours, less than 3 risk factors for acute MI, and patients that had more often false activation tended to be older. They tended to have prior myocardial infarction, left ventricular hypertrophy, left bundle branch block, paced rhythm. And in younger patients, they tend to have early repolarization or pericarditis. Now, Karen, you guys have looked at this. In Dallas, do you have any comments about this? Or?
Well, we called them, we didn't call them false activations, we called them activation without intervention, because there were those patients that really did look like STEMIs and had all the risk factors, and then when they got to the cath lab, they were not that. But we had relatively few. I think for the 600 people that we had documented, there were only like 6 activations without intervention. So
Wow.
it's minimal.
What's your experience in San Antonio, Greg?
We've recently adopted that similar terminology because of the issue of the false activations, then looking back at it, and they followed protocols, but they decided at one point to not end up getting a balloon at the cath lab. I would say our numbers are not that good, but we do very little exclusionary. We take everything that's brought in from the entire system, and then we try to tease out the ones that met the protocol versus the ones that and then that didn't have something happen versus the ones that didn't meet protocol. So
what do you call them?
I think we're using the same terminology: activation without intervention, and then we have the false activations and the other ones and then the ones they don't activate that we find out should have been.
Okay. The group in Los Angeles reported 25% activation without intervention rate, and part of when they stopped including left bundle branch block, that reduced significantly.
Yeah, we don't use left bundle, but we do have we don't do reciprocal changes, so we have a fairly high. I mean, I think ours is, when you take all comers, it's in the 20+% range, but we're trying to tease it out. We've just been teasing it out more recently.
Catherine, do you have any idea about CETRAC?
We do not get information on false activations currently, so I do not.
Probably that would be something to look into, because that's going to be a key criteria. Josie, Todd, you guys have any information on that? No? Okay. Some of the take-homes that Dr. Wozniak put together was the ECG findings, the clinical picture, and the absence of cath lab contraindications all ought to be considered. Then STEMI equivalents: left bundle branch block, posterior MI, left main occlusion pattern. Perhaps those also ought to have a low threshold for going to the cath lab. And then post-cardiac arrest without ST elevation, I think we are taking the tack that it's probably not the right thing to do to go to the cath lab. How do you do that in San Antonio?
It's I can only really speak of my particular hospital, and they will take post-arrest, whether elevation or not, although they prefer to more of a, the elevation or more of a classic story. But as far as the region goes, I can't really speak for some of the other hospitals.
Karen, in Dallas, post-arrest, do they go to the cath lab a lot, or they?
We did not in this study. We didn't track the CPRs at all. That's a separate effort.
Okay. All right. So this is an algorithm that Tim put together, and so you can work through that. But the first thing, obviously, is to get an ECG, and if there's no ST elevation, then you have to think twice about activating. If they're not candidates for cath lab for various reasons, obviously you're not going to activate the cath lab. And then once you get past those two things, evaluating the final clinical diagnosis, and go ahead with catheterization. So, for instance, if they still have ST elevation, then but they're a DNR from a nursing home, do you go to the cath lab? I mean, these are things that have to be considered, and unfortunately, in the middle of the night, at least in our situation, we sometimes get asked to take those folks in. So this is something I think that there's room for rational consideration about. So one of the pushes in our institution is to try to optimize or try to push people toward radial intervention. In other words, catheterization via the radial artery for STEMI patients rather than from the femoral artery. And there was a publication on this called Rifle, I don't know how to pronounce that acronym, STIACS. Basically, they randomized patients to either radial access or femoral access with ST elevation. Most of them, whether they went in femoral or radial, were successful, and so that there was a good segment to be analyzed. So what they found was that in patients who had radial access, the adverse events were 50% reduced, and the composite of cardiac death, target lesion revascularization, and stroke was also significantly better with radial access, and the main driver of that was cardiac death. So very interesting to me that actually there were fewer deaths in the radial intervention group than not. Why would you,
Is there any postulation on where that's coming from?
The only thing I can think of is disasters with femoral access. Maybe somebody got fibrinolysis before they were brought in, and access was, shall we say, had a misadventure. And I don't know. That's all speculation. I haven't really drilled down on that. But clearly, the bleeding complications are dramatically reduced by radial access. The flip side is if somebody needs a balloon pump or in shock or they're hemodynamically unstable, going directly to femoral access is probably reasonable because you're going to be there anyway. So. Okay, so out-of-hospital cardiac arrest and hypothermia. I think this is another important area. So they talked about the post-cardiac arrest brain injury, post-cardiac arrest myocardial dysfunction, systemic ischemia, reperfusion response, and unresolved processes that cause the arrest. So the question is, if somebody has a cardiac arrest, was it primarily cardiac or was it something else? Basically 80% of the out-of-hospital cardiac arrests tend to be cardiac in nature. Not always are they related to STEMI. If one has cardiac arrest in the field and one feels that the patients should have therapeutic hypothermia, then generally the goals are to cool them within 4 hours of the onset of their event. So reach a target temperature of 33 degrees within 4 hours. They talk about the FiO2, optimal FiO2, hypercapnia, EEG monitoring, and blood pressure, maintaining blood pressure greater than 70 mean. And then once you're committed to this road, then waiting at least 72 hours before you make a decision on whether to withdraw or continue support. The other caveat is if one has a post-cardiac arrest patient, you've entered into this treatment algorithm. If they haven't had a STEMI, but they're having, that you could see by ECG, but they're having hemodynamic instability, ventricular arrhythmic instability, then they suggest that they ought to go to the cath lab sooner than later and make sure they don't have a left main occlusion or some critical stenosis. There was a suggestion that you might consider massive PE, obviously, and then beyond that you can talk about adrenal insufficiency treatments, glycemic control, and DVT and GI bleed prophylaxis. So these are the what they felt were the questions. So one of the questions is, how do you make the decision about whether to initiate hypothermia? So, Craig, what do you think?
In general, I mean, that's depending on if the system either adopts it pre-hospital or not, it's going to be protocolized. And then the goal is to continue that internally. I know there's more and more data coming out on this that I think is going to continue to sort of muddy the waters on how effective it may turn out to be. And I think it's a component, I think like a lot of things in critical care resuscitation, it's probably an important component, but not the reason. So when the studies come out, depending on which side of, if you either like it or don't, you'll be able to argue your point. I think the important part is that if it gets started, it gets continued upon arrival. I know in our region, it's part of the protocols, and it started, and it's pretty simple stuff. I mean, we had, in this particular World for Cardiac, we've had discussions with our lab about the difficulty of all the fancy gizmos and things you have in the hospital. So we keep things pretty simple with the simple ice packs and chilled saline until they can get through the lab, and then they can fire up all the Arctic Suns and all that kind of stuff internally. Because we're not realistically going to, when you look at some of the pre-hospital data, it talks about how it doesn't quote unquote work, but that's because I think there was a misconception that you were going to actually reach target temperature in that time frame, and obviously you're not going to probably reach your target temperature unless they're already there in the pre-hospital or even in the emergency department. It's really more about the ICU and that 4-hour window. So.
Okay. Then the question is, how do you determine who should go to the cath lab?
That's often based on your cardiologist.
Okay, so for those of you that don't work in this area, one of the predictors of good outcomes is if the initial ECG showed ventricular tachycardia. If they're in PEA or asystole, then the outcomes typically are not favorable. So ventricular tachycardia is good. Short duration of arrest, obviously, so less than 10 minutes of unsupported cardiac arrest. In other words, no ACS, no CPR before 10 minutes is an issue. So I don't think that anybody's settled on a way to predict. And that's always troublesome because you know, let's see how to put this. There are certain neurologic consultants that will come in, stand at the doorway, look in, and then tell the family that the patient's brain dead, I'm so sorry, without ever even examining the patient or talking to them. And, you know, if you go in and you push on them or rub their sternum and they come off the table, then you might have to rethink that. I think that this is an area of opportunity, shall we say, for us to better hone in on what to do. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit already. If they have a VFib arrest, many of them have coronary artery disease. It does not always show that with ST elevation they have coronary disease without ST elevation. And we know that if they go to the cath lab and they've had a short arrest time, then they do have a good survival. The problem is we're at the present time, if we take these patients to the cath lab and they have poor prognosis already and they're in asystole as they roll in, they're going to be in asystole most likely at the end of the day. And we get dinged for a PCI death. So at the present time, the cardiac arrest patients are still included in our elective PCIs. We talked about that. Who is working on that? I thought that there were some efforts to change that at the CMS level.
I think on state and national levels, I mean, it's a kind of a generalized discussion, and it's slowly working itself through. I don't know any specifics locally, but it is a challenge because, you know, even when you have the arrests that you have the persistent VF or VT, and so you've optimized the best chances they're going to have, they still, unfortunately, overall will have a poor outcome, and that's really, for the cardiologist willing to take on that challenge, that unfortunately hurts their numbers that, of course, are now published publicly, and it's they get punished for being the more aggressive, more willing providers to take care of these critically ill patients. So this is something that really needs to be pushed at all levels possible to try to get changes or be able to carve out those critical ill patients.
All right. On Friday at the STEMI meeting, unfortunately I wasn't able to attend that, but there was a discussion about legislation for STEMI care analogous to the stroke legislation and trauma legislation. So these are the comments. The pro-government comments are here. He quoted, Dr. Wozniak quoted me, but I think that's fair. We still have the highest mortality, and it's something that can be reduced substantially if we get our acts together a little more effectively. But we have no funding. So I think this is an issue that has to be dealt with. There are some questions about whether or not the current certification process is viable. In other words, the hospitals, many hospitals are currently getting certified by Mission Lifeline, and not all are, but the question is how long will they continue to do that? Is there a better mechanism for funding those efforts and so forth? Catherine, do you want to talk a little bit about that? You want to weigh in on this? I mean, you've been intimately involved in that.
Well, I do see there's been a lot of discussion with our EMS partners that if they don't have a mechanism for them to identify those facilities that at least report data and that can show quality metrics and are willing to share those metrics, that they won't drive patients to those facilities. So I think that one's going to drive the other. Either we're going to have legislation or EMS is going to continue to drive it because that's how we're doing it now. So I think that we're going to have to come up with a mechanism, but I don't know how quickly we're going to be able to get government legislation behind it. So now we're going to have to keep it homegrown.
Mm-hmm. Karen?
I think Catherine's right that EMS is sort of driving the train, but I just don't, we don't have a full complement of EMS response because of our first responders that don't necessarily report. So we may be getting skewed data there. As far as, and Catherine told me earlier that there are actually in the action registry some EMS data points that we can use. We probably need to expand those. But as far as funding, we're going to have something to be able to continue it and make it what we want.
Yeah, I was able to attend some of that discussion. It was actually, I think, a well put together kind of point counterpoint on the different sides. And I think the one thing I took away from it, realizing it from the cardiology side that I didn't know all the details of, I think moving forward, the importance of any potential legislation is knowing first what we want, which other than obviously funding for this, which is important, but some of the current concerns brought up where there's already registries, there's some national registries that are probably long going that are going to be tied to CMS, and there were fears of duplicating services and then of course causing accreditation that doesn't necessarily mean anything as far as they were concerned. But the EMS EMS is driving this now, and I think we do it for trauma, we do it for stroke. There's really no reason to not have some sort of mechanism in place. Maybe it's not as robust as we have talked about in the past with the hospital accreditation systems and all these kind of details, and it may just mirror on top of what already exists. I think, as we know from past legislative experience that occurs in this state and around the country, the danger gets in how detailed you write the law. So you want to be broad enough to not list specific things that may not exist in the future, but not so broad that no one knows what to do with it. And I think that's going to be the challenge for all the parties that are involved in this and interested in this over the next, year and a half for the next cycle.
Todd?
Yeah, I didn't get to go to that presentation, but I think in our region it's probably some of the same concerns is, if there is legislature and there's no funding, then we're still in the same boat that we are. And so I think we have to continue to evaluate everything and tread carefully as we move forward so that we actually do end up, at the end of the day, with a system that really does work for the end user, the patients that we all care for.
Okay. So, I wasn't part of this discussion, and perhaps you guys know a little bit more about it. So what is critical access funding? How does this work? No?
I think this has to do with the particularly small rural hospitals that are designated critical access hospitals to provide at least some limited services, and with budget cuts and funding, I'm assuming that's being scaled back, but I don't know the details.
So one of the things that's been talked about is if it appears that the best outcomes occur when you have pre-hospital ECGs and a hospital doesn't have the ability to purchase 12-lead ECGs for the paramedic units, then we think that's the right thing to do. Then it would be good to have a mechanism to get that equipment to the hospital. So we probably shouldn't talk about this much more other than say that this is one of the issues that needs to be touched on. So this is, I couldn't tell where this slide came from. I just got back from South Africa, and it turns out that in the animal world, once you get to be, shall we say, experienced, you tend to be weeded out. And one of the things that we found out about was water buffalo. So once the water buffalo males are determined that they're no longer capable of defending the herd, so to speak, they're weeded out, and they tend to band together, and they call them the Duggar Boys. And we had the opportunity to see a group of 10 Duggar Boys out of the sort of a little meadow out in front of the game lodge we were at. But that caused me to reflect on this. One of every 5 cardiologists is 60 years or older, and half of the practicing cardiologists over the age of 50 are over the age of 50, and there's only 900 cardiologists going into the field each year, which means we have a little bit of a problem as the cardiologists become Duggar Boys and get weeded out. So I think this was an interesting concept. For those of you that don't know, young Dr. Phillips was not terribly supportive of the efforts and feels like the Duggar Boys shouldn't be having much of a role in this discussion, apparently. But I don't think that there was much offered in the absence of the Duggar Boys. So another issue that was brought up about government is the data, and having useful vetted data would be very helpful. On the other hand, it needs some infrastructure support. We need out of pre-hospital phase data to be collected as well, particularly in the area of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. So this is another area where government intervention could be helpful. The comment was made that once reimbursement was tied to outcomes, to performance, then people actually started paying attention to getting the door-to-balloon times down, at least in Maryland. So governmental intervention does help drive outcomes.
I'd just say,
Yeah, go ahead.
one thing also about the idea of the infrastructure and allowing the pieces in place. You know, the reality of it is there's lots and lots of databases out there. There's a lot of pre-hospital data being collected on arrest, on STEMIs, both in the state, the region, and then national. And there's obviously a lot of data collected in the hospitals. And it's in most cases, it's pretty easy that the data gets pushed from the EMS to the hospitals because they're always eager to have that. The challenge comes with the return data and then being able to look at this as the big picture. So if anything, you know, other than obviously funding is probably the most important part of anything that would go forward with legislation, but the next, I would think one of the next most important parts is just the ability, even if it simply takes databases that already exist and piggyback on top of them or create something new, that ability to have a one-stop place to pull the data for the entire process, in particular STEMI care. Because where it is right now, if you're lucky enough to be in a system and a region that gets cooperation with the hospitals and it has the ability to send that data back, particularly when you're talking about small rural hospitals where the cardiac person may also be the stroke person, the trauma person, and the charge nurse in the ER, and 2 or 3 other jobs. Clearly, it's difficult to be dealing with multiple different systems and multiple different entities. So that's where the data's all out. The data's out there. And there's a lot of good data out there. Just being able to tie it together and sort of forcing those that aren't willing to participate as much to be able to share that data would go a long way in helping figure out what the next thing needed from wherever you are in the state.
Anything to add? No? Okay. So the argument against government, now this is from Dr. Wozniak, remember. So the argument against government involvement.
There's no slides.
Look at all the paperwork we have to do now, and government cannot get it right, it only gets in the way. So those were somewhat, I guess, emotional statements. Was there anything else that came out of that, Greg?
It took longer to get to that, but that was basically the 2 points, I think. It's just, the issue of too much government.
Too much government. So one of the concerns by a cardiology group was that imposing guidelines for certification of STEMI operators were obstreperous, so to speak. God forbid you should have to do 12 STEMI interventions a year to get certified as a STEMI operator, et cetera. So those things will have to get vetted, apparently. Okay. Anybody else go to the STEMI Texas meeting that wants to weigh in on takeaways? No. It's a pretty exciting meeting. Well, could we go to that PDF file? So on Thursday, let's see, it was Thursday morning, we had a group meeting to discuss the potential for developing STEMI databases in Texas. As some of you may have heard that there was a line item that was generated by the legislature to deal with STEMI databases for stroke and STEMI, and there was a proposal for suggested funding of this, some of which was to support positions at DISHS, which I think are critical, and other things. So actually Dr. Mixon picked a group of people to participate in this committee meeting, and the ones that I have noted here, and this may not be all inclusive, but Russell Griffin from AHA in Dallas, Wendy Sechrist from AHA National, Lonnie Den from AHA, Dr. Wozniak, Joel Romo from AHA, David Wampler from San Antonio, Dr. McCarthy from our institution, and Greg Damer from Scott and White. Basically, what we talked about was, oops, hold on a second. Let me get this up just 1 second. Some of the potential considerations, for instance, not all systems are identical. Large urban systems would probably work in a different way than rural or suburban systems. And then remote systems and how we define remote, I think we'd have to figure out, but by remote, I'm thinking the hospital you described, Craig, with the nurse paramedic being everything. So the question is, how do you communicate between the GTAC CCC committee and the RACs, and should there be bi-directional feedback? And I think those are all important. One of the things that sort of sprouted up through this is this NIH-funded effort, the CCTS, which is a translational science consortium. It turns out that there is a CCTS in Houston, in Dallas, and in San Antonio, which would, at least to some of us, it seems that that would be a reasonable group of people that could act synergistically to focus on data issues from these metropolitan areas. The UT School of Biomedical and Bioinformatics actually has developed a Red Hat-based database that is compliant with NCDR, the ACC effort, as well as Action. So all the fields are mapped so that filling out that database could be then exported to both NCDR and Action. It's our understanding that Action and the NCDR database may be merged. And Dr. Anderson, who's one of our faculty members, is on the ACC database committee and is part of that merging effort. So he's been helpful to help work on this database and so forth. So this was discussed. David Wampler from San Antonio expressed some interest. Craig, can you talk a little bit about his role in San Antonio? And
Well, yeah, so every month the cardiac committee meets, and I see Dudley there who can step in and correct me if any mistakes here. But I mean, Dr. Wampler helps compile all the data we get every month throughout the region from STEMI activations, and takes a look at, again, what we were talking about earlier with what we would consider true false activations, activations without interventions and whatnot. And then that, as part of the monthly meeting, goes over so all the players in the system can take a look at things and move the system forward and make any potential changes. I mean, the last several months there's been kind of ongoing discussions. Do we need to change up what our criteria is? And those kind of discussions take place at that level. But the data is, we've got a robust pre-hospital database in the STRAC region that collects, I think to date over the last several years, over 1 million pre-hospital records, and obviously pulls out the cardiology parts of those and the STEMIs. And so that gets looked at and then pushed to the hospitals, and then trying to share, and then the hospitals share back as much of the data as they can, and then we can really take a look at that. So when it works great. And he does a lot of effort with that, among obviously a lot of other people.
Okay. And then we also discussed funding possibilities. The $500,000 that was allocated by the legislature over 2 years basically would probably fund DISH's positions and a few other things, but certainly couldn't support building up a whole database. We personally put in over $400,000 in the database development, which is basically we have a database that could work. And so we were thinking that by getting the CCTS groups together and people who would like to participate in a steering committee of sorts for the database, we could begin to look at possible structures, possible costs, and so forth. We talked about the possibility of saying, of parlaying the $500,000 that's been committed to by the legislature in various geographic regions to grateful patients that say, would you match this money to allow us to continue the effort? And I received a commitment from one of my patients to have a fundraiser around the 13th or 14th of December to address this issue. So I think if that could work, then we might be able to provide that model to other geographic regions so that we could pit San Antonio against Houston and Austin against Houston and so forth. Dallas raised $3.5 million and did a great job. I think those monies have pretty much been used up, but I think that might be something that you could be taken back to Caruth or other foundations and say, look, other regions are putting together this money. There's been some discussion about TTAF being involved, and I think that potentially is serving as a conduit for funds and so forth. So all of those things will need to be vetted and discussed. I think we probably ought to open it up for public comment at this point if anybody would like to discuss potential and volunteer for the committee, et cetera. Are you awake, Dudley? Well, I figured you were going to talk anyway, so I mean. Might as well get some time. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I'm certainly willing to help out. I think we just need to make sure we have a long-term focus. You know, we recently, as part of the Accelerator program, got all of our PCI centers to start submitting data to action, and part of that process was probably a misperception on our part, but we thought that the data extractors would be able to pull that data out, it would go to action, and we'd get all that data back, because like Dr. Cooley said, we had 1 million EMS data points to our data that Action is not including, although they're working on including more. Because of how we collect our EMS data, we have a ton of it. That's not the way it's working out. And so our facilities are a little bit bothered because they don't want to have to extract data to go one direction and turn around and re-extract that data plus some additional stuff to come to us, and now potentially have to re-extract data and go to a third place. And so I think that continuity is critical. I think for the regions that are doing their own thing, I think they need to be a part of this. I think that needs to then fold into what's going to be at the state, and then out of the state gets flushed what needs to go to the national, and that way your facilities are more apt to participate. Another piece is you're already collecting all the EMS data you would need, because we report every run, in theory, we report every run we make to the state of Texas today, although not everybody's doing that. But so that data from pre-hospital is already sitting there. You just have to figure out how to match it up to the patients on the cardiac side so that you can pull those data points that you would want. And then the only other thing I would caution is that EMS has learned this over the last 50 years. I would come up with a funding scheme that's not dependent, and I don't mean this in a bad way, I'm going to use the EMS lexicon. It's not dependent upon pancake breakfasts and barbecues to fund it into the future. It's great to build a state registry, but if we build it on donated dollars, like the Caruth system, and all of a sudden those dollars go away, what happens to that registry? I think we need to work on using that $500,000 and then determining what it would take in the future to sustain it. If we're going to build one, it's got to be sustainable, which means there's got to be people behind it that want to push it. There's got to be stuff coming out of that that can be shown to be a benefit. And so when you look, I mean, unfortunately, it's the bane of the existence of the trauma registry. The trauma registry only exists today in Texas because TxDOT needs the crash data. That's the only reason it's there. And they funded it time and time again, 2 or 3 different efforts to make it work well, and it's continually struggled. And I would hate to see a lot of time, effort, work at raising funds go in to do something. Those raised funds run out, somebody passes away, a foundation takes a different angle to go fund something else, and all of a sudden that registry dies on the vine, so to speak. So I mean, that'd be my part. As the chair of the cardiac committee in San Antonio, I'm more than willing to help on that committee. I'd willing to be a part of it just to protect our interests and our data. And so please put me down for that. But that's kind of from what I've heard from that discussion, kind of my first initial thoughts.
Thank you. Anybody on the committee want to have a discussion? Oh, yeah. Uh-oh, here we go. All right, Eric.
We've only got 35 minutes left.
Yeah. Happy birthday to you.
It's not my birthday. I agree with what Dudley just said, and I think it's important that we look for long-term sustainable funding that needs to come through the state. I think that anytime we find funding from charitable organizations, when we find everything has a tail. And I think that while I am not a huge fan necessarily always of the entire process with DSHS and all of the bureaucracy sometimes, I do like the fact that RFPs will have to be written, that theoretically best of breed will come to light, that the process is open and transparent. And I think we owe it to Texas, we owe it to every person who's going to have a heart attack in Texas to track this, to study it, to find new ways to treat it, and we need to have the data to do that. The second piece I would strongly ask the Cardiac Committee of GTAC is to make a recommendation to AHA, to Action, to NCDR, to whoever, that we would like our data back to this state, please. That the regions uniformly agree that if hospitals submit data into the action process, and we're highly supportive of Mission Lifeline, we're highly supportive of the AHA, and we're highly supportive of the action process. And to continue the support, it's critical that we get simple, easy extracts of the data, not reports. The data needs to come back so that people can sift through it in the manner we're doing. And yes, each individual hospital can pull a thumb drive of the report for themselves and carry it across town, but thumb drives aren't really popular nowadays, right? I mean, it's very kludgy for each healthcare system. I have 53 hospitals. You guys have over 100. It's ridiculous that hospitals are submitting through a process through maybe it's their quality vendor, maybe it's abstractors working in the hospital, and they're getting submitted to a centralized place, and the centralized place can't check a box and say all these 50 hospitals or 90 hospitals, here's the raw data back to that region, if, and with the caveat to what I'm saying, if the participating hospital grants that permission, right? I'm not asking for a report, for the data extract if the hospital does not agree with that. But if the hospital says, yes, please, dear Lord, give them the information, that's what we thought we were agreeing to, was to submit to AHA, and that AHA would return that back to our regional data processes so we could study it. I don't want a report. I don't want a query. I don't want a PDF. I want the data that our hospitals fairly agreed to. They thought that's what they were doing when we signed up.
So if you submit the data from the hospital doesn't necessarily have a database that can house that data. Is that what you're saying?
It exists on the AHA portal. Now they can pull their own data back down. They can pull an entire report. The entire raw data extract can be pulled back down.
You can do that.
You can do that today. And so 53 hospitals have to pull that down into 53 USB keys, tie them up in a big knot, run them over to our guy, and he has to insert 53 of those, pull the report back up, right? And by the way, let's say there's 250 data points. What if the hospitals uniformly only agree to 125, they only want to share regionally 125 of the 250? Well, before they hand the USB key over, they have to open up the report and delete out. It's a raw data extract. So they're going to have to remember to delete that out. You see what I'm saying? So instead of doing that in sort of a more logical process with AHA as a partner, that's what we're looking for. I will tell you the conversations we're having in San Antonio right now with our PCI centers is just to establish something in between the action registry and our hospitals. Because then if they submit to the intermediate product at the region, we'll submit to action. Action gets to keep their business processes, And frankly, then we'll control the complete piece. I think that's a bad mistake. But that's how frustrated we are right now.
Okay, I think that's the direction we're moving. I think that was sort of the general idea with this database proposal. Okay. Thank you. Anybody, Catherine, you want to weigh in here?
Well, one thing I will say is I'm a complete supporter of the American Heart Association Action Registry, Mission Lifeline programs. I think it's a great way for us to recognize those facilities that are providing good STEMI care. Just to mirror some of the frustration is, as a region, and us being a partner with the Duke STEMI Accelerator Project, which San Antonio is as well, in order for the RACs to receive the regional report, we have to go through our hospitals. And so the RACs themselves cannot even, we don't even have access to just even the regional data, not the drill down data, but we don't even have access to our regional report unless we receive that from our facilities. Even though we as RACs are expending time and energy through manpower and through hours of going through the data. I've done several hospital visits to help them understand where their measures are and where they fall, where they can improve their data. I'm doing that to support the STEMI systems of care, but in order for me to do that, I have to go on the back end through my hospital. So I think that that's, if we can't do anything else, at least for the regions to be able to get their own regional reports, I think that that would be at least a good first step.
So there's an intermediate database effort that could incorporate the EMS data that's not captured by Action, and then could port that data out to Action, but we would have the data here that we could deal with however you want to deal with it. That does make some sense.
Well, but the issue is Action is getting the EMS data. And this, you know, one of the issues with the idea of the state, you know, this idea of too many layers and stuff, it doesn't make sense. It's already pushing forward. They have all the data. It makes no sense why they can't push, well, they can, so it doesn't make any sense why they won't allow that to go back in, with the clear caveat, like Eric said, that if a hospital doesn't want to have their data out and they want to be on a little island or whatever, they have that right. They agreed to, you know, they could share the data they want to share. And it's just this layering upon layering of these workarounds that doesn't make any sense. I mean, it sort of brings up, my personal question is why, you know, again, the database is wonderful, the HA does a great job on a lot of different things, but it's kind of like, why are we still doing this when we're going to create our own system? We're going to apparently have to create our own system and a workaround, and then it's going to be variable across the state by region, and there may be some, you know, sharing of data points and stuff, but again, it doesn't make any sense why it can't come back with whatever security caveats and you know, data ownership that's out there for the hospitals.
It's my understanding the pre-hospital data set in Action is very limited and not nearly what we really need. So.
It is very limited.
They're working on expanding it.
I was going to say it's limited, but it's working. It's working on. It can be expanded, but at the very least, even get the hospital data back. If I misspoke about the level that they're getting to Action, but to be able to have the hospital data back for the agencies. The other issue I would argue is Action should be increasing how much they do get from EMS.
Yeah.
So, a couple thoughts. First of all, I think we've got to be careful as a state to stop spending money in a fragmented way, with a little money here toward stroke and a little money there toward stroke, and oh, we're taking yours this year and going to give it over here. And meanwhile, we don't get the synergy from the dollar that we should get. And it's the same thing with cardiac care. Also, with the Heart Association, I've always been a supporter of the Heart Association. I've been on their board in Houston. But I have to tell you, I look at them as a vendor. And we need to remember that is the role. It should not be the tail that wags the dog. Thank you.
I absolutely agree about getting the reports back, and it would be very helpful to have the raw data. In the prior meeting, there was a comment made about how we need to, I think it was go home with the person who brought us to the dance, that it was AHA that helped get the money, et cetera. I can assure you that the hospitals in the state of Texas have paid far more than that in just agreeing to use their system. So we should be a partner. We should not feel like we are obligated to AHA. And I'm not sure that that is carried across the board.
So it dawns on me, you know, good is the enemy of great. Right? We have potentially some great cardiac systems. Cardiac care is going to happen at a local and regional level. It is not going to happen at a national level. The national organizations need to find ways, and the accelerator grant or the accelerator program is exactly one of those examples. But a cookie cutter template to bring somebody from standing flat to walking and running, that model works well. Where there are systems that can run quickly, we're giving them training wheel type material. We're going to have to provide the clinicians who are actually caring for patients, the researchers who are actually there and understand the eccentricities of a regional system. We have to empower those local people with their data. We will never succeed if there is simply one giant database in the sky that all of us participate in. Good is the enemy of great, and we have to enable our regional systems to be completely autonomous and full functioning while submitting to the good. Right?
Okay. Got it. Any other comment? I'm not sure we have any action items at this point for the general meeting. The next date, Jane? February
12th, 13th, 14th.
Thank you, Jen.
Sure.
So February 12th through the 14th. Any, pardon?
Do you know our time? Or?
Not yet. Okay. I think it's cold and wet and outside, and not many people felt the need to come to the meeting. I think we've covered a fair amount, and I'm not sure that we have a lot of additional information to talk about. Anybody need to add anything? Up.
The presentation that you have from Dr. Wozniak that you went through, it was very difficult to see in the back. Can it be posted in the web?
Yes.
The one that CETRAC hosted?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. And I do echo the other RAC comments about allowing the systems that are already developed. We're a rural suburban area, and we have a very good STEMI system that is multiple facilities that are owned by different entities, multiple EMS providers. So keep that in mind that I'm from Waco. That it's not just Dallas, Fort Worth area, Houston, and San Antonio that have been working really hard and want to be part of the process.
Absolutely.
I had facilities that were interested in being at the meeting that was held at the STEMI conference in San Antonio, but we didn't know where, when, and how that occurred, so that information did not get out as I think it probably should have. We sent people to that conference to be at that particular meeting and discussion that we had talked about at the August GTAC, but no one, the information about that meeting didn't permeate everywhere. So just, I'm not sure how it went out, but just so you know, it didn't get to everybody.
Well, it's Dr. Mixon's meeting, really, so,
And I can email Dr. Mixon
yeah, why
too,
don't you
but
tell him, I mean, he's pretty close to you, isn't
he is pretty close. I can throw a stone at him.
he? Yeah, there you go. Well,
But
not hard.
I just wanted you to be aware that maybe you're not getting any input from everybody because everybody doesn't know what's going on. I know that cardiac care is very important across the state of Texas. As a RAC, we talk about it all the time, and we share amongst each other best practices. So I'm confident that not everyone is getting all the information, but I'll email Dr. Mixon about
Yeah.
it. But if we could post that to the little document section that y'all developed, that would
Yeah.
be great.
I thought it was on there, wasn't it?
I didn't go there right before the meeting to see, so I
See,
apologize.
that's another issue, so,
Thank you.
thank you very much. So we may need to talk about sending some sort of blast to availability of information on the website. Is it possible to do an email blast to the members of GTAC and their affiliates and RACs and so forth about the availability of STEMI information on the web?
We could do something on the way that happens, Dr. Smalling, is that we use GovDelivery. So the people that are interested in receiving the notices and updates have to basically sign up to receive them versus trying to manage and maintain a listserv that we can, pull down and pull things out. So I think the best way to do it is maybe come up with a couple of sentences to put on the cardiac committee's webpage, directing them to go wherever and saying, these resources are available, and outline what you want them to know.
Okay, well, we'll look into that then.
Okay. So once we put it on the webpage, then the notice, once it updates, it automatically shoots out to everyone that's signed up.
Okay, very good. Any other business? All right, well, we stand adjourned. Thank you very much. Stay warm.